Hi, so this week we're going to focus on communicating in organizations. And I'm guessing all of you have had challenges with communication in an organization that you've worked with or been part of. This is typically the number one response to questions about why didn't this work or how come something didn't happen. And it always boils down to some sort of communication glitch. So this is critical for us when we're trying to manage an organization to make sure that we are communicating well with the people that we work with, whether subordinates or people who are above us or with our colleagues who are on the same level of the organization. Okay, so here we go. We've got some goals and objectives. Let me pull this down to that. Give me just a moment. Okay, so first, we should be able to describe the communication process by the time we're done with this discussion. Second is we should be able to kind of appreciate the role of listening in effective communication. Quite often people don't think of listening as part of the communication process, but in fact it is. It plays a significant role in the success of communication. By the time we're done with this discussion, you should have a better understanding of the barriers or gateways to communication. And we should also recognize the differences between defensive and non-defensive communication. This is an interesting concept. A lot of people don't really conceive of communication in this way. And I think just having an awareness of it can expand our opportunities to communicate more effectively. We're also going to explain the impact of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is critical to people's willingness to listen to what we're doing. It's quite astounding, frankly, how much nonverbal communication impacts people's ability to pay attention to what someone is saying. Next, we're hoping that by the time we're done with this today, you'll be able to list the elements of positive and healthy communication in an organization, and then to recognize the impact of technology on communication. So, ideally, you will be able to discuss each of these objectives pretty readily by the time we complete this discussion today. Okay, moving on to our next slide. The model. There are different parts to the communication model. The first one is the communicator, the one doing the communicating. So this would be the person who is speaking at the moment, or who is the person who initiates an email or a text. The receiver is the person on the end, who is the person you are sending the text to, the person you are talking with as you're communicating, and so on. So the receiver can be an individual, it can be a group of individuals, whatever it is. And then perceptual screens, the things that we perceive that help us screen out or screen in information that we receive as receivers. So perceptual screens can impact the quality of communication, it can impact the accuracy of communication, it can impact clarity. So our perceptions play a very large role in communication as well. I'm sure all of you have had a supervisor at some point or another that you just didn't care for so much, and that gets in the way perhaps of you truly listening to what they have to say, because every now and again, even those people we don't care for so much do have good ideas. Okay, so communicator, receiver, perceptual screens, and then the message itself, the content, the words, and ideas chosen to relay a message. Words play a big role in how people receive things. The ideas that we communicate clearly impact the way we as a receiver receive something. And then affect, or the feeling or emotional component of a message, plays a role in how, again, messages are received. And then feedback. Feedback can be in the form of someone's changing facial expressions, so those nonverbals. It can also be an actual response. So feedback can take on a variety of different forms. So again, our model, we have a communicator, we have a receiver, we have perceptual screens, we have the message itself, and then we have the feedback. Okay, so we have 5 components to a communication model. Okay, moving on to our next slide, slide number 4. There's something referred to as reflective listening. Reflective listening has a goal to correct, to address inaccuracies and misunderstandings. Now, the goal is not to correct the person doing the communicating. The goal is to correct your understanding of the message. Okay, so the goal is not to correct the person who is the communicator. It is to correct your understanding of what they're trying to say. And when you're doing this, you quite often will minimize the likelihood that there will be conflict if you put it on yourself to make sure that you are understanding what they're saying. Okay, so the goal here is to correct inaccuracies, to correct misunderstandings. So you may have heard one thing, they may have meant another. So if you work with them to come to understand what was said, we're in great shape. Reflective listening does require careful listening. It requires that you not be formulating thoughts and responses and so on while the person's communicating. It means that you just listen. You don't formulate a reply. You're not thinking about your grocery list for class. I used to, when I was bored in my undergrad classes, I would do things like that, make lists of things I had to do rather than really paying attention to what my faculty members were saying. I know none of you have ever done that, but I did that as an undergrad. It also requires repeating back what you heard, again, to ensure that there aren't misunderstandings, to take care of the inaccuracies in your understanding. So you repeat back the message that you heard. And then the focus here is on the receiver when it comes to reflective listening. It's the receiver that's doing the reflective listening. And we're focusing again in the workplace. Now, a lot of these skills can be used in your private life as well. So this reflective listening enables the receiver, again, to understand the communicator's meaning. Reflective listening can reduce perceptual distortions, again, because you're repeating back the heard message and clearing up misunderstandings or inaccuracies. And then it ideally will lead to overcoming personal barriers that can lead to a communication breakdown. Again, I've had supervisors that I really wasn't very fond of, but taking the time to listen to what they're saying is an opportunity to overcome those personal barriers. And personal barriers often can lead to communication breakdowns because you just don't want to listen to them because you know that their ideas tend to be counter to your own. However, positive thing for the organization is to come together and reach a consensus using input from both sides. Okay, so reflective listening, important part of the communication process. Moving on to slide number 5, a little bit more about reflective listening. It can emphasize personal elements of communication. If you're doing it appropriately, it will reflect empathy and concern for the communicator. This is one thing that when you're working with a subordinate, you want to make an effort to reflect that empathy, reflect that concern if they're coming to you with job concerns, because it will allow you to ensure that the work gets done in the way that you want it done. Okay, the receiver needs to pay particular attention to the feeling component of the message. And the feeling component comes from tone of voice, it comes from facial expression if you are face-to-face, comes from body language, and so on. So when you're doing reflective listening, it's not just to the words that are being shared, but it's to everything that is part of the message. It emphasizes responding to the communicator, but not leading that communicator along the way. So you are responding to what they're saying. You aren't putting words in their mouth. That's what leading the communicator often implies. It's not what we're trying to do with reflective listening. And then there are 4 verbal responses that are generally part of reflective listening process. So affirming contact. So when somebody is listening to you and they're nodding their head, they are responding with okay, got it. Those kinds of responses indicate that they're actually paying attention. Not always. However, it can often indicate that attentiveness. Paraphrasing, this goes back to responding to that message to ensure what is going on in that message. So often I will have my students in my undergraduate class paraphrase what I told them to do, again, just to ensure that we are both on the same page. Another verbal response, clarifying implicit thoughts and feelings. So sometimes I'll have students come and they might be really frustrated about something, and I'll just tell them that I get the impression that you're really frustrated, or you're really, you're kind of down in the dumps today, or you look really tired. And some of them will really say, yeah, I really am, and here's why, and because it affects their work. And that clearly is the case with your employees, with your colleagues as well. So verbal responses, clarifying those implicit thoughts and feelings, goes a long way in effective communication. So reflecting on core feelings not fully expressed. Sometimes someone will say, I'm really frustrated about this, and really, in the end, they're not frustrated as much as they might be disappointed. Sometimes somebody has worked hard on a project, and in the end, that project isn't given a green light. And so they act like they're frustrated, but sometimes really not so much frustrated as disappointed in that they put in all this effort, and in the end, it was, seemingly for naught. Okay, so reflective listening plays a huge role in effective communication. And it's hard. A lot of us don't practice effective reflective listening very often. Hard thing to do at times. All right, so moving on to slide number 6. Slide number 6 refers to communication skills for effective managers. Now, the research suggests that there are 5 skills that distinguish good supervisors from bad supervisors. And again, these are big picture suggestions. And as you'll see, I have good supervisor and bad, good and bad in quotation marks. So the research shows that these skills are particularly important for effective communication in a workplace. So here we go. Expressive, sharing ideas and thoughts and feelings is important to effective communication. Your employees are much more likely, under the circumstances based on the research, to do the same thing, to share ideas, to share thoughts, to share feelings about a project or whatever it is that you're discussing, if the supervisor is willing to do that. This can ensure and build trust in an organization, and people don't work for people they don't trust. They don't do good work for those people. So empathetic, able to hear the feeling or emotional components of messages. Certainly there are people who have many challenges in the workplace, and there are many opportunities to be empathetic. So, for example, one of the challenges I just had presented to me, one of my students was a little bit beside herself, one of my undergraduates, a little bit beside herself because she wasn't certain she was going to make class. Very good, attentive student, comes to class all the time and so on, because she just found out that she is expecting a child. And so understanding her challenge with coming to class, she was a little bit distraught about that. So to be able to be empathetic to the challenge she faces was helpful. She's actually been able to be in class all the time. And I'm very proud of her for that, given her surprise, frankly, that she is expecting a child. And so now trying to manage that whole thing along with a full-time job and so on and so forth. So sensitive. When we communicate with people, we need to be sensitive to the self-esteem of others. To tear someone down in a public setting is really not appropriate, and good managers recognize that. And so if they have some constructive feedback to give someone, providing that in an environment that is less public is certainly strongly encouraged when you are working with your employees. So you work hard to respect other people, frankly, to be sensitive to their self-esteem. Also, effective managers tend to be persuasive when they're communicating. Sometimes we have to do things we just really don't want to do, and that includes our supervisors. And so they will work hard to, good ones, will work hard to be persuasive when talking to their subordinates, to their colleagues, and even to their supervisors, because we often have to convince supervisors that this is a good idea, this is a project that needs to happen. So skills and persuasion when communicating are really critical. And then last but not least, most people focus on this, is being informative. Clearly, more information is better than less. Transparency is critical to being successful in what you're doing. And certainly times when it's not appropriate to be transparent, but you certainly keep people informed that you're working on the project and it will be available then at such and such a time or whatever it is. So being informative to the extent that you can, given the work that's being done, is another distinguishing characteristic or skill of good supervisors. And again, this is a generalization, and of course there are certain situations in which this may or may not be appropriate, but overall these are the things that the literature shows are important for good supervisors when it comes to communication skills. Okay, so moving on to our next slide. So barriers to effective communication. Physical separation can play a role in effective communication. I know that many of my students, when I talk about effective communication in business schools particularly, find that some of them have some serious challenges because they work in international settings. So for example, my friend that works for Merck Pharmaceuticals, sometimes she'll be up at 10 o'clock with meeting with her colleagues across the globe, because for some of them that's 8 in the morning, and for some of them it's 5 in the afternoon, and for her, 10 o'clock at night, and that's when the team can work. And so sometimes that physical separation causes some challenges in communication. Status differences. This is one that's relatively typical. People who are supervisory or even 2 or 3 levels above an individual in an organization that status difference will make it difficult for that communication to happen. Sometimes people are just intimidated by people with more seniority, with big titles in an organization, and so on. So status differences kind of play a role. And this is particularly true when you have an international workforce. This is less so in the American workforce, but if you have an international workforce, this will be much more pronounced. There are gender differences in the way we actually position ourselves for conversations. And this can also impact communication and the effectiveness of communication. So women tend to sit so they can face one another when they have a conversation. So pay attention to this when you're, out and maybe you see two women sitting together. They sit so that they can face one another. So they may be across from each other, or if you're at a square table for 4 people, they will be sitting next to each other so that they can, one on each of 2 sides of a table so that they can look at each other when they communicate. Men, however, tend to sit side by side with a common focal point. So if you have a table with 6 chairs and 4 people are meeting, the guys may end up sitting so that they can all, let's say, watch the screen versus face each other for that conversation. Women will much more likely face each other. And women tend to send less information to supervisors and experience less information overload than their male employees. So women get less information in a workplace than men do, typically. Now, this does not refer to the general everybody gets it sort of emails, but it's often the more casual interactions. Women just aren't communicated with as readily as men are, and this is based on the research. This isn't something that people have dreamt up. The literature shows that this is the case. So women don't communicate as much with their supervisors, and they are communicated with less than male employees. Very interesting information on barriers to effective communication when it comes to gender differences. Okay, so moving on to slide number 8. So more barriers. Cultural diversity is a big barrier to effective communication, and what I mean by this is largely international, having an international workforce. And this doesn't even always apply to international. Cultures have very different views of who should be in a meeting, who should be communicated with, and then how that communication happens. And clearly language plays a role. So language, though, can vary even within regions in a country. So when I moved to Virginia, one of the words I came across is coofer. I had no idea what it meant. So do any of you know what a coofer is? A coofer refers to a file full of exams that were from previous classes that is kept by a fraternity so that students have past exams to study from. They aren't current exams, they're past exams, but it's a file of past exams for various classes that fraternity brothers can use to study for future exams in that same class. Okay, so that's a coofer. Very common word used on the campus at Virginia Tech. And then, does anybody know what a poke is? And yeah, no, not on Facebook, but a poke. It was another word I learned when I moved down to Virginia and went to school at Virginia Tech. A poke is simply a bag that you put something in. So when I first went to the bookstore to buy my books, and I actually did go to the bookstore, somebody asked me if I wanted a poke for those books. I had no idea what they were talking about because I'd been there about a day and a half. So it's a bag. So language barriers, not only with different countries, but also even within our country, because of regional variations, can be a challenge when trying to communicate with someone else. All right, so slide number 9, we're moving on here. So gateways to communication, or ways to communicate more effectively. First is gender. Become really aware of communication styles of men and women in the workplace, because they do tend to be different. And actively seek clarification. This goes back to that reflective listening. Don't assume that you understand. If it's not absolutely clear, don't assume you understand. Just go and ask again, because it makes much more sense to get that clarification up front than to do something that wasn't what was being expected from you. So ask for clarification. Cultural diversity. Just take every advantage of every opportunity to increase your awareness of the various cultures with whom you work. It will enrich you personally, and it will improve your ability to communicate with people from different cultures. And again, we have a variety of different cultures right here in our own country. It doesn't have to be people from a different country. And then language. When we're communicating in the workplace, it often is easy to start using jargon and technical language. And it's easy to use some of those acronyms that are normal for our environment. So one of the acronyms that's always used in the work I used to do in the health department is FEP. It's FEP, pronounced like F-E-P. It's not F-E-P, it's P-H-E-P. And I'm going to guess most of you have a very little understanding of what I mean. So we need to stay away from this jargon and that technical language. And FEP is Public Health Emergency Preparedness, for all of you that did not know that. So it would not be appropriate for me to use that in this class, since that's not something we're talking about. And then use simple declarative sentences, simple, brief declarative sentences when speaking with people, because that will minimize the likelihood of misunderstandings. And a declarative sentence is one that is merely stating something. Okay, so you're declaring something. All right, so gateways to better communication. We have being aware of gender issues, gender differences, being aware of cultural diversity, and using language appropriately. Okay, so slide number 10. Defensive communication. People engage in this in many, many situations. I've seen it happen in a lot of meetings where people aren't happy with something, so this is what happens. They get aggressive, they're angry, or they are very passive and, well, I don't care. Do whatever you want is kind of an example of passive, defensive communication. And then withdrawing. They just don't even participate in the conversations. And I'm guessing a number of you can relate to some of these characteristics or these behaviors when it comes to communicating in an environment where things are contentious. All right, so defensive communication is characterized by aggression, anger, passivity, and withdrawal. The outcomes of this kind of behavior are people who feelings are hurt, and you see this all the time in the workplace. People's feelings are hurt, and we can't just leave who we are and our emotions at the door. That's not useful, actually, in an organization. We all, kind of have drummed in our heads, emotions have no place in the workplace. But in fact, they do, in a variety of different ways. However, we can end up with people who with injured feelings. That's not, frankly, useful to getting the work done at work. This defensive communication also can lead to communication breakdowns. It can lead to alienation and people not feeling like they're part of anything. It can result in destructive and retaliatory behaviors. I've seen this happen too in many, many, many workplaces. And again, I'm sure some of you have seen this as well. And then everybody starts blaming everybody else for something that's happened. These kinds of things are particularly detrimental when you have a supervisor who engages in aggressive, angry, passive, or withdrawing sorts of behaviors, because again, we have these kinds of outcomes. And remember, our goal is to have a productive, effective, efficient workforce. Okay, so moving on here from defensive communication, we're going to move on to some more on defensive communication. So we have someone who is referred to as a dominant defensive. This is the person that's I'm right and you're wrong. And I'm sure we've all seen people, take on this stance. They tend to be active, aggressive, and attacking in the way they communicate. This is a behavior also exhibited, by people with low self-esteem. And again, this is all based on research. This isn't just, me dreaming this stuff up. This is all based on research on communicating in organizations. This is often displayed, unfortunately, by people higher up in an organization. That's unfortunate, but we do see that pretty regularly, particularly when the organization isn't doing as well as they would like. Some of the tactics are power play. So these people start insulting people, start putting others down. They start labeling people as, insubordinate, or however you might want to label it. And they may provide misleading information. I've seen this happen actually in academic institutions, and it's unfortunate. So we have a dominant defensive. I'm right, you're wrong is a way to characterize how they interact with their views, and then they tend to be aggressive, active, attacking other people. The people who use this way to communicate tend to have low self-esteem. So defensive communication, we are going to move on to our next slide. Let's see. Oops, sorry. Our subordinate defensive. You're right, I'm wrong. Okay. These are people who they may not truly believe that you're right and that they're wrong, but this is what they'll say because they are the subordinate. They tend to be passive and submissive. They do not adequately assert thoughts and feelings, and depending upon the workplace, being assertive is not an acceptable thing for people to do. Someone who takes on "you're right, I'm wrong," they're trying to cover up aggressive and hostile views of what's going on. This tends to be exhibited by people with low self-esteem as well, and it tends to be people lower in the organization. So lower in the organization in the sense that they are communicating with someone who is superior to them in the hierarchy of the organization, or they're dealing with someone who has less time in at the organization, so their tenure with that organization is less than the other people. They may be colleagues, but they have less tenure in the organization. Okay, so again, a subordinate defensive. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're subordinate to the people you're communicating with, but for some reason you take on this stance. You generally, again, potentially have low self-esteem, tend to be passive and submissive in the workplace, and I think you guys can think of someone who probably fits the bill. They don't adequately assert thoughts and feelings, and they may actually have some hostility to what's going on, but they're not willing to voice that hostility or that aggression in a positive way. All right, so defensive communication, we're going to continue with our conversation. Moving to the next slide. Now, non-defensive communication. So we have some examples of defensive communication, and defensive communication tends to be a negative thing in your organization. You don't want that. You want non-defensive communication because it's constructive. Okay, non-defensive communication is powerful. It's self-affirming. It is not self-aggrandizing. Many people tell you all about everything that they've done. That's not what constitutes powerful communication. It's not self-aggrandizing, but it is self-affirming. So this is a person that will stand up for themselves. They'll say, hey, I know something about that, without going on and on with why they know something about that. These are exhibited, non-defensive communication is exhibited by people who are centered. They are assertive, not aggressive, but assertive. Tend to be controlled in the way that they interact with people. They are informative. They are realistic about their own skills, the skills of others, and what can be done. And they tend to be honest people. So people who communicate in a non-defensive way offer constructive communication. It tends to be powerful in the way that it functions, and it's exhibited by people who are centered, assertive, controlled, informative, and realistic and honest communicators. So, non-defensive communication, much more beneficial to an organization than defensive communication. Moving on to nonverbal communication. Turns out up to 90% of a message is nonverbal. Okay, so think about this. You might hear a comment from someone, but 90% of what they are communicating is nonverbal. So nonverbal communications include gestures. So you can clearly hear it, imagine this, the thumbs up, the peace sign, and, other less appropriate gestures. That's a form of nonverbal communication. And then the way someone uses space is part of nonverbal communication. If you are taking up more space by the way you stand, by the way you hold yourself, and so on, it conveys confidence. If you're hunched over, if you are sitting with your arms crossed and you're hunched over, that's communicating something as well. So the way an individual uses the space around them, the way they carry themselves, communicates a lot. Nonverbal communication also includes all of the elements of communication that do not include the use of language. So it could be anything other than the words that you use. Okay, so how fast you speak, how slowly you speak, how loudly you speak, the inflections that you use, all of that is included here. So there are 4 basic types of nonverbal communication. We have something called proxemics. We have I can never say this, kinesics, facial and eye behavior, and then paralanguage. And we'll move on to those. First, we have proxemics. We'll move to slide 15. Here we go. It's the study of the use of space. And just a little bit about this. Personal space tends to be greater for countries in cool climates. So people from the northern part of the US, people from the northern European countries, people from Russia, and so on and so forth, their personal space tends to be larger than for someone from a much warmer climate. Also, sitting across from someone sets up a competitive environment. So sitting next to someone will minimize the confrontation that could be implied by the way you sit. You don't want to sit next to someone that you don't like, or that you're going to have an argument with. You sit across from them. Think about a circumstance in which you've had a disagreement with someone. You don't want to sit next to them. You don't want to be near them. So this is the same kind of thing. So kinesics is the study of the use of body movement. So your posture, and again, when someone has their arms crossed and their knees crossed, or their legs crossed, quite often we read that as being a closed posture, meaning that they're not open to the ideas that they're hearing. So listen, pay attention to people when you're out, and see, if you can find a group that may be having an argument. See what the postures are. Someone who will turn their back to the speaker. That person is not interested in hearing what they have to say. And then pacing. If someone's pacing back and forth as they're talking or as they're waiting for something, it's a sign of nervousness. This is really clear. Someone will be pacing, and if they can't pace, they might be tapping things. They might have a foot shaken up and down if their legs are crossed. Can be a sign of nervousness on their part. Plays a role in communicating. Okay, so moving on to slide 16. Nonverbal communication, a little bit more for you. Face and eye behavior. Dynamic expressions offer clues. So people who have more expressive faces will probably tell you a lot about what they're thinking. So it may, the way their eyes work, yes. So we often think if people don't have eye contact with you, then clearly they're not being truthful. They're being deceptive. And this isn't always true depending upon the culture, okay? So as it says in the next one, cultural context can impact the meaning. In some cultures, averting eyes, not making eye contact with someone who is more highly educated, is superior in the organization, whatever it is actually a sign of deference and not mistrust or lying. In the U.S., eye contact, direct gaze at someone indicates that you're honest, but not necessarily so in other cultures. So facial expressions and eye behavior are contextual. So paralanguage, this is one of the other components of nonverbal communication. Paralanguage refers to the pitch of someone's voice. So the higher pitched could mean the more stressed they are. It could mean that they're excited, could be both. How loudly someone speaks also will indicate perhaps their passion about something. It can indicate anger, because often people will speak more loudly when they're angry. How fast someone speaks also is a form of communication. Someone speaking really quickly, it might imply that they are trying to get something else done and they don't really have time to talk to you. Or if they speak more slowly, it could mean that they are considering what you're saying. I have a student in one of my classes who speaks very slowly, and sometimes I just want to pull it out of him what he's trying to say. So I have to work hard to not do that, because he has great thoughts, but he does speak very slowly. And actually there's some research that shows Gen Ys speak much faster than baby boomers and the traditionalists. And then people speak more quickly in different parts of the country. Different cultures speak more or less quickly. So the tempo of speech plays a role in communication. And then tone. Tone of voice is so critical in communication. So very clearly, someone can, say something in a tone of voice that very clearly communicates anger, although the words themselves are not angry. Or they can communicate joy, even though the words themselves are not joyful, or a whole variety of other examples. So tone of voice is critical in communication. And this trips a lot of people up. This really plays a big role in communication. So moving on to our next slide. Let's see, here we go. Let's see, we'll get there in a minute. There we go. So communication and technology. There's some research that shows interpersonal skills like graciousness and tact diminish when the communications are electronic. You're not facing someone, so I can be a jerk in my email because I don't have to look them in the face. One of the things that I will often do if I'm asking someone a favor, I will go see them, because it's a whole lot harder to say no to a face than it is to an impersonal email. So the research shows that people tend to be less gracious and less tactful when using technology, email, text messages, and so on to communicate. Managers tend to be more blunt when using electronic media. So two of the things to watch for when you're using electronic media to communicate with people. One of the benefits is that there's more immediate access to information. We don't have to wait to hear from a colleague, wait weeks, days, whatever it is, to hear from someone. We can most likely hear from them immediately or almost immediately, because we have email, because we have texting, because we have instant messaging, and so on. One of the things technology does is shield people from personal interaction. I don't know how many times I catch myself sending an email to the person literally sitting in the office next to me, and you don't have to interact with them face to face. Because of some of these challenges with technologies, some very progressive workplaces have actually prohibited the use of technology on certain days to ensure that people are interacting face to face. There is research that shows it's actually been very effective in assisting interaction in the workplace to eliminate the use of electronic media on certain days. Very interesting work there too. So communication and technology, it has its good points, it has its bad points based on the research. So we are getting to our last slide, slide 18. So communication and technology. Part of the challenge with technology is virtually all of those nonverbals are missing. Given that 90% of communication is nonverbal, this is a serious challenge. I know that I have completely misinterpreted emails from people because the nonverbals were missing. So we have to guard against that. One of the positives about communication technologies are that it equalizes participation in groups. Often we don't know who that person is other than by their name. We don't know their title, we don't know any of those things. And so that will make it much more likely that people will participate in a conversation. I have students who wouldn't begin to say something in class face to face. We're much more likely, much more comfortable with online discussions. Now, with communication and the technology that we use to communicate, the potential for overload is great. I don't know about any of you, but I sometimes can get close to 100 emails in a day, and that's just the emails. That's not the content of the email. Some of them will then provide a host of information, valuable, fabulous information, but I just can't get to it because there's too much. I get email from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention at least 2-3 times a week. Great information, but because I have so many other messages, I just don't always have time to read through it. Okay, communication technology encourages multitasking, and it is absolutely the least efficient, least effective way to get work done. And frankly, if you have someone face-to-face and you're using your electronic communication, there are a lot of people who find this, frankly, quite rude, and it will lead to communication breakdowns. People will get frustrated, they'll get angry, and so on. Another challenge with this electronic communication is that people will be less patient with face-to-face communication. They find that potentially it is less effective, less efficient. Others find it exactly the opposite. Rather than having to send a string of emails to get something accomplished, you just go talk to someone, takes a minute, you're good to go. So benefits and drawbacks to some of that technology that we tend to rely on. And then our last slide, last but not least. Oh, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that was the last one. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation about communication in organizations. I hope that you are able to take some of it back and use it yourselves. And I look forward to reading your discussion posts on communication in the workplace and hearing about the articles that you read. And good luck with everything with this week's postings. Take care.